What if the people who truly control the world aren't human at all? For decades, a controversial theory has claimed that a hidden race known as the Reptilian Elite secretly influences global power. According to believers, these shape-shifting reptilian beings disguise themselves as world leaders, celebrities, and powerful elites while manipulating events behind the scenes. Ancient myths, conspiracy theories, and modern internet investigations have all fueled the idea that something strange may be happening behind the curtain of global politics. But where did this theory actually come from? Is there any evidence behind the claims, or is it simply one of the internet's most fascinating conspiracies? In this video, we're diving deep into the mystery of the Reptilian Elite and the theory that a hidden race may be controlling our world. There is a man in rural Ohio who has not watched network television in 11 years. He stopped, he says, not because he grew bored with it, but because he began to see it. He began to see the patterns underneath the broadcast signal, the hidden geometry of what was being chosen for him to watch, what was being kept from him, what was being laundered through entertainment and news and the comfortable rhythms of prime time into something he could swallow without question. His name is not important. What is important is that he is not alone. He has never been less alone in his life. He is part of a community that spans continents and generations and income brackets and levels of formal education. A community united by a single foundational conviction that the world is not run by the people we are told run it. That beneath the visible architecture of governments, corporations, central banks, and media conglomerates, there exists a hidden layer of control so ancient and so absolute that most human beings cannot bring themselves to contemplate it. And at the center of that conviction, for millions of people around the world, is the belief that this hidden controlling class is not entirely human. This is not a fringe belief tucked into the darkest corner of the internet. A 2013 survey conducted by Public Policy Polling in the United States found that roughly 12 million Americans believed that the country was run, at least in part, by shape-shifting reptilian aliens. That number, striking on its own, represents only the Americans willing to confirm such a belief to a pollster, which means it almost certainly undercounts the actual population of believers. Other surveys conducted in the United Kingdom, Australia, and across Western Europe have produced similarly startling numbers. A 2021 study by the University of Cambridge found that belief in some form of shadowy elite control, not necessarily reptilian in nature, but structurally identical, had become statistically mainstream across multiple democracies, with well over 40% of respondents in several countries agreeing with statements that mapped closely onto the core premises of what researchers call elite conspiracy theory. The reptilian variant is the sharpest, most vivid, most cinematically extreme expression of something that exists on a much wider spectrum of human belief. And understanding that spectrum, understanding why it exists, and why it persists, and why it has accelerated in the 21st century, is the task this documentary sets out to accomplish. We are not here to mock. Mockery has been tried by journalists, by late-night comedians, by academics writing dismissive footnotes, and it has produced precisely nothing except the further conviction among believers that the people doing the mocking are either unwitting dupes of the system or active participants in it. We are here to understand, which is a harder and more uncomfortable thing, because understanding requires taking seriously the conditions that make these beliefs possible, taking seriously the genuine failures of institutions that create the void into which conspiracy fills, taking seriously the psychological and social and political dynamics that transform a person from skeptic into true believer, and taking seriously, above all, the real and documented harm that these beliefs cause when they metastasize from private conviction into public action. The theory, in its most elaborated form, goes something like this. Thousands of years ago, perhaps before recorded human history, a race of extraterrestrial reptilian beings arrived on Earth. They are variously described as originating from the Draco star system, or from a parallel dimension that intersects with our own, or simply as a species that evolved on this planet alongside humans, but in a hidden evolutionary branch that diverged long ago. These beings, whatever their origin, discovered in humanity a remarkable resource, a species that could be domesticated, managed, milked for energy, for labor, for the specific psychic sustenance that reptilian entities allegedly require, which is the vibrational frequency produced by human suffering, fear, and trauma. Over millennia, these beings crossbred with the human population, producing hybrid bloodlines that carry both human and reptilian genetic material. These hybrids look human, they live among us as humans, but they are fundamentally different in their psychology, their loyalties, and their biological needs. And they have systematically placed themselves in control of every major institution on Earth: governments, militaries, financial systems, religious organizations, media empires, pharmaceutical companies, and the entertainment industry. They are the royal families of Europe. They are the banking dynasties of the past 2 centuries. They are the political families that recycle their names through the highest offices of democratic nations. They are, if you know what to look for, visible in plain sight. This is the world that David Icke built, and it is, without question, the most influential conspiracy framework of the late 20th and early 21st century. But before we can understand how it was built, we need to understand who moved in. The community of reptilian conspiracy believers is not a monolith. It contains multitudes, and understanding its internal diversity is essential to understanding why the theory has proven so durable and so resistant to debunking. There are, broadly speaking, several distinct populations whose beliefs overlap with this framework, and they come to it through very different doors. The first population, and probably the largest, consists of what researchers call generalized conspiracy believers, people whose encounter with the reptilian theory is downstream of a broader, prior commitment to the idea that power operates in secret, that official narratives are constructed rather than discovered, and that the gap between what institutions say and what they do is not occasional or incidental, but structural and deliberate. For these believers, the reptilian theory is not necessarily taken literally. The shape-shifting and the lizard DNA and the underground bases may be understood as metaphor, as symbolic language for something that is otherwise difficult to articulate, that the ruling class feels alien, that their priorities feel inhuman, that they seem not to care about ordinary people in the way that ordinary people care about each other. This population is vast, and it extends well into the mainstream. When a survey respondent checks the box agreeing that a small group of people secretly controls world events, they may not be thinking about reptiles. They may be thinking about hedge funds. They may be thinking about the 2008 financial crisis and the people who caused it and the total absence of criminal accountability that followed. They may be thinking about pharmaceutical pricing or about the revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate, or about the documented non-conspiratorial reality that concentrated wealth translates into concentrated political influence in ways that democratic theory cannot comfortably accommodate. For this population, the reptilian framework is a vivid, extreme, and sometimes darkly comic expression of a grievance that is entirely legitimate at its core. The second population consists of what might be called spiritual seekers, people whose journey into conspiracy belief began not with politics or economics, but with an interest in alternative spirituality, in ancient wisdom traditions, in the idea that mainstream science and mainstream religion have both conspired to suppress truths about the nature of consciousness and the cosmos. This population tends to be genuinely curious, often well-read in esoterica, and drawn to David Icke's work, not despite its spiritual dimension, but because of it. Icke has always framed the reptilian narrative within a metaphysical context, the idea that we live in a kind of holographic simulation, that human consciousness is a fragment of infinite universal consciousness that has been hijacked and imprisoned by lower vibrational entities, that the reptilians are themselves victims of a cosmic process of disconnection from source. This language, drawn from a wide range of traditions including Gnosticism, Theosophy, certain strands of New Age thought, and what Icke calls simply the ancient mystery school teachings, resonates deeply with people who have already decided that the materialist consensus reality is a kind of prison. For them, the specific claim about lizard people is less important than the broader spiritual architecture Iki provides, a story in which human beings are fundamentally divine, in which our suffering is inflicted by external forces rather than arising from our own nature, and in which awakening to the truth of our situation is the first and most essential act of liberation. The third population is harder to categorize and more politically concerning, and it consists of people whose journey into reptilian conspiracy belief has passed through, or runs parallel to, harder forms of political extremism. Because the reptilian theory, as we will examine in considerable detail later in this documentary, did not emerge from nowhere. It has deep roots in a much older tradition of conspiratorial anti-Semitism, in which the idea of a hidden, non-human controlling elite functions as a coded or literal substitute for the Jewish global control narrative that has animated pogroms, genocides, and ethno-nationalist movements for centuries. Some of the people in this third population are aware of those roots and consciously draw on them. Others are not aware of them and would be horrified to learn about them. But the structural overlap between the reptilian framework and classical anti-Semitism is not accidental, and it is not peripheral to this story. It is, as we will see, the most important and the most dangerous thing about it. Between these populations, and overlapping with all of them in complex ways, are millions of ordinary people who hold the belief at varying levels of intensity and commitment. People who are convinced, people who are curious, people who say they are just asking questions, people who find the whole thing entertaining but believe it might also be true, people who have built their entire identity around it, and people who knew someone who went down the rabbit hole and lost them. All of these people are part of this story. In the spring of 2022, a researcher named Kate Starbird at the University of Washington, whose work focuses on the spread of online misinformation and conspiracy belief, published a detailed analysis of the information ecosystem that surrounds what she calls crisis misinformation. Her finding, consistent with a broad body of research that had accumulated over the preceding decade, was that the spread of conspiratorial narratives is not primarily driven by ignorance. It is not the case that people who believe in shape-shifting reptilian elites have simply been deprived of correct information that would set them straight. It is the case that they have been embedded in information environments that are socially and emotionally rewarding, that confirm their existing intuitions, that provide community and meaning and a sense of special access to truth, and that systematically shield them from information that would challenge those intuitions. This distinction between ignorance and motivated reasoning embedded in a social environment is fundamental to everything that follows in this documentary, because it means that the solution to conspiracy belief cannot simply be more facts. It has to involve something much harder. To understand what that something might look like, we need to spend time with the believers themselves, not to dismiss them and not to validate them, but to understand what the belief is doing for them, what need it is meeting, what it is protecting them from, and what it is exposing them to. Consider the profile of a woman in her late 30s living in suburban England. Let's call her Sarah, who came to the belief through a combination of grief and internet research. Sarah's mother died of cancer in her mid-60s, having been treated with a course of chemotherapy that Sarah felt, in retrospect, had accelerated rather than treated her illness. In the immediate aftermath of that loss, Sarah began researching alternative accounts of cancer causation and treatment online, which led her through a succession of YouTube channels and websites and forum communities into a world in which the medical establishment was not merely fallible, but deliberately concealing cures in order to maintain a profitable treatment paradigm. This is a belief that many people, including some with medical training, hold in some version. It is not the same as believing in reptilian elites, but the cognitive journey Sarah took, from trusting the official narrative, to questioning it, to finding communities that offered alternative explanations, to deepening her commitment to those explanations in the face of social pressure from friends and family who thought she was losing her grip. That journey is structurally identical to the one that ends with someone believing that the British royal family are not fully human. And for Sarah, it continued along exactly those lines. Within 2 years of her mother's death, she had arrived at David Icke. Within 3, she considered herself fully awake. What is notable about Sarah's story, and what is notable about hundreds of similar accounts collected by researchers studying conspiracy radicalization, is the emotional coherence of the journey. At each step, the new belief served a psychological function that the previous step had created a need for. The grief of losing a parent required an explanation that was adequate to the magnitude of the loss. A random bad luck encounter with a cancer that chemotherapy could not cure is not an adequate explanation. It is too small, too meaningless, too devoid of agency or moral structure. But a cancer that could have been cured, that was kept from Sarah's mother by institutions that valued profit over human life, is a story in which the loss has meaning, in which there is someone responsible, in which Sarah's grief can transform into anger and her anger into purpose. And as that story expanded, as the question of why cancer treatments are suppressed grew into the question of who is suppressing them and who profits and what other things are being suppressed, the comfort of having an explanation, of belonging to a community of people who share your explanations, of feeling that you see what others cannot, became itself a form of addiction. Not metaphorically, neurologically. The brain processes social belonging and explanatory satisfaction through reward pathways that are as real and as powerful as those activated by other forms of addiction. This is not unique to conspiracy belief. It is a feature of human cognition that applies to religious conviction, ideological commitment, and brand loyalty as much as to belief in lizard people. But it is particularly acute in the conspiracy context because the belief is designed, whether deliberately or emergently, to be self-sealing. Every piece of contradicting evidence becomes proof of the conspiracy's reach. Every person who challenges the belief becomes a potential agent of the system. Every moment of doubt becomes a test of faith that the true believer is meant to pass by, doubling down rather than opening up. This self-sealing quality is what makes the belief so persistent, so immune to debunking, and so destructive both to the individuals who hold it and to the social fabric they inhabit. We spoke with Dr. Michael Shermer, founder of the Skeptics Society and one of the most prominent scholars of paranormal and conspiratorial belief in the United States, about the specific psychological mechanisms that make the reptilian theory so powerful. His answer was surprisingly sympathetic to the believers, even as he was unsparing in his analysis of the belief itself. What the reptilian theory does, Shermer explained, is it externalizes everything, every problem in your life, every injustice in the world, every moment of suffering or confusion or frustration. It all becomes the product of an external force that is deliberately doing this to you. And that is extraordinarily comforting, because the alternative is that the world is just complicated and chaotic and unfair in ways that don't resolve into a coherent story. Most people find that alternative much harder to live with than even the most terrifying conspiracy theory, because a terrifying conspiracy theory still gives you an enemy, and if you have an enemy, you have a potential solution. Chaos gives you nothing. What Shermer is describing is a cognitive orientation that psychologists call external locus of control, the tendency to locate the causes of events in forces outside oneself rather than in one's own agency or in the impersonal operation of circumstance. Research consistently shows that people who have experienced significant trauma, significant disempowerment, or significant loss of control over their own circumstances are more likely to develop this orientation and more likely to seek explanatory frameworks that give that orientation narrative form. This does not mean that conspiracy believers are broken or pathetic or lesser. It means they are human, and that they have encountered conditions in their lives that have, in entirely understandable ways, shaped their relationship to explanation and to trust. The relationship to trust is perhaps the most important element here, because the reptilian conspiracy theory, like all grand conspiracy theories, is fundamentally a theory about the untrustworthiness of institutions. And the untrustworthiness of institutions is not a paranoid fantasy. It is a historical and contemporary fact documented in exquisite detail by journalists, historians, researchers, and in many cases by the institutions themselves when forced to disclose what they have done. The FBI ran COINTELPRO, a systematic program of infiltration and disruption of civil rights, socialist, and Native American organizations, including the deliberate manufacturing of paranoia within those organizations. The CIA conducted MKUltra, a program of non-consensual experimentation on unwitting human subjects in search of mind control techniques. The United States government conducted the Tuskegee syphilis study, deliberately withholding treatment from black men with syphilis over a period of 40 years in order to observe the disease's progression. The tobacco industry suppressed its own research, demonstrating that cigarettes caused cancer for decades. The opioid crisis was manufactured in part by pharmaceutical companies that knew their products were causing widespread addiction and lobbied regulators to allow them to continue marketing those products to physicians. The financial crisis of 2008 was the product of documented fraud at virtually every level of the mortgage securitization market, and no senior executive of a major financial institution was criminally prosecuted for it. None of these things are conspiracy theories. They are documented history, and they provide an entirely rational basis for distrust of official institutions and official narratives. The problem is not that people distrust official institutions. The problem is what happens when that distrust, which is often warranted, is captured by an explanatory framework that extends it beyond what the evidence supports, that transforms legitimate skepticism into a comprehensive alternative reality that personalizes and racializes institutional failure in ways that have historically led to catastrophic violence. The reptilian theory is not the root of institutional distrust. It is a parasite that feeds on it. In 2019, a team of researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a study in the journal Science that analyzed the spread of true and false information on Twitter across a decade. Their finding was both alarming and clarifying. False information spreads faster, farther, and more broadly than true information on social media platforms, consistently across every topic category they examined. And the primary driver of this differential is not bots or coordinated inauthentic behavior, though those play a role. The primary driver is human beings. Real human beings find false information more novel, more emotionally engaging, and more worth sharing than true information. This is not a malfunction of human cognition, it is a feature of it. We evolved to pay attention to surprising, threatening, and morally charged information because in the environment of our evolutionary development, such information was more likely to be survival relevant than routine or neutral information. What has changed is the information environment, which now generates a continuous torrent of surprising, threatening, and morally charged content that our evolved attention systems cannot adequately filter or contextualize. Into that information environment, the reptilian conspiracy theory fits with almost perfect precision. It is surprising, it is threatening, it carries enormous moral charge, it generates immediate emotional responses, and it connects every individual node of information, every government scandal, every instance of elite misbehavior, every unexplained event, into a single coherent narrative architecture that makes the world feel comprehensible. In the attention economy of the 21st century, a theory like this is not fighting against the algorithm. It is the algorithm's most beloved product. We need to spend a moment with the geography of belief, because where people believe and in what concentrations tells us something important about the conditions that make belief possible. The United States has the largest documented population of reptilian conspiracy believers in the world. And that fact is not incidental. The United States is also a country with a healthcare system that regularly bankrupts its citizens, a political system that visibly serves concentrated interests over popular ones, a history of documented institutional betrayal of its most vulnerable populations, and levels of social trust and institutional confidence that have been in continuous decline since the 1970s. It is a country where the gap between the official story about how things work and the experienced reality of how they work is exceptionally wide for a large proportion of the population. That gap is the petri dish in which conspiratorial belief cultures. This is not to say that other countries are free of the phenomenon. In the United Kingdom, where David Icke was born and where his theory first took shape, belief in elite conspiracy is widespread and has deep historical roots in anti-establishment sentiment that predates Icke by generations. In Germany, the Reichsbürger movement, which denies the legitimacy of the Federal Republic and believes in various elaborate conspiracy frameworks about hidden controllers, has tens of thousands of adherents and has repeatedly produced incidents of violence against public officials. In Russia, state-sponsored conspiracy theory has been weaponized as a tool of foreign policy, with reptilian and Illuminati frameworks deliberately seeded into online information environments as part of influence operations designed to deepen social divisions in Western democracies. In Brazil, the political movement that coalesced around Jair Bolsonaro drew heavily on conspiracy frameworks that overlapped with the global elite control narrative. In India, conspiracy theories about globalist elites that map onto the reptilian structure have merged with long-standing traditions of religious nationalism and ethnic paranoia to produce dangerous political formations. The phenomenon is global, it is accelerating, and it is not going away. The man in rural Ohio is still watching, not television, of course. He is watching the feeds on 3 separate platforms that he has curated over years into something he describes as an information environment that has been cleaned of propaganda. He can tell you the names of the banking families he believes are at the top of the hierarchy. He can tell you about bloodline research, about the genealogical connections between presidents and monarchs that YouTube researchers have spent thousands of hours compiling. He can tell you about the symbolism hidden in plain sight in corporate logos, in the layout of capital cities, in the choreography of major cultural events. He has a library of perhaps 300 books and a hard drive with terabytes of documentary content. He has lost his marriage, 2 close friendships, and his relationship with his adult daughter over these beliefs. And he is aware of this, and he is sad about it, and he believes that the sadness is the price of being awake. He believes that the people he has lost were not capable of seeing what he sees, and that he cannot pretend to see less than he sees in order to keep them. This is where the belief has taken him, to a place where the epistemological framework he has adopted is more real to him than the people he loves. And that is perhaps the most human and most heartbreaking thing about this whole story, not the lizard people, not the secret bloodlines, but the way that a search for meaning, a desire to understand, a refusal to accept that the world is governed by indifferent chance, can lead a person step by step into a prison more complete and more isolating than anything any reptilian overlord could have designed. We begin this documentary in the ordinary world, in the living rooms and chat rooms and YouTube channels and church halls and online forums where this belief is negotiated and transmitted and amplified, because that is where it lives, not in some sinister underground compound. In the ordinary, achingly human landscape of people trying to make sense of a world that seems to have stopped making sense. To understand how they got here, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a man standing on a stage in Birmingham, England in 1991, wearing turquoise, making claims that would get him laughed off national television and would, within a decade, build him one of the largest conspiracy audiences on Earth. But before David Icke, there was everything that made David Icke possible. There was the long tradition of hidden controller belief that winds back through centuries of human history, gathering force at each turning point of social disruption and institutional betrayal. And there was the specific mid-20th century moment in which the theory took its modern shape. There was the Cold War paranoia, the counterculture, the collapse of the post-war social contract, and the emergence of the internet as an environment in which previously marginal beliefs could find each other and amplify. There was the history of anti-Semitism, which we cannot and will not avoid, because the reptilian theory cannot be honestly understood without it. All of that comes later. What we want to establish here, in this opening chapter of our investigation, is simply this, that the people who believe in a hidden reptilian controlling elite are not, for the most part, stupid. They are not, for the most part, mentally ill. They are people who are genuinely afraid, genuinely distrustful, genuinely in search of explanation, and genuinely embedded in social environments that reward and reinforce those searches in particular directions. They have been failed, many of them, by the very institutions that the conspiracy theory targets. And they have found, in the conspiracy community, something that those institutions failed to provide: belonging, meaning, purpose, and the intense satisfaction of feeling that they see what others cannot. Understanding that is not the same as endorsing it. The beliefs are wrong. They cause harm. They have caused deaths and violence and the destruction of families and the corrosion of democratic public life. But they are not inexplicable, and they are not going away without a serious engagement with the conditions that produce them. That is the work of this documentary. And it begins, as all serious inquiries must, with the question of where the story actually started. The architect, David von Icke, was born on April 29, 1952, in Leicester, England, into a working-class family that, by his own account in numerous books and interviews, was marked by economic hardship, emotional distance, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness. His father, Barak Icke, worked in a factory and later as a market gardener. His mother, Barbara, raised the children in a household where money was always tight and aspirations were always carefully managed. Icke has described his childhood as one of profound isolation, of feeling fundamentally different from the people around him, of sensing that the world visible to others was not the only world, that something lay behind the surface of things that he alone was somehow positioned to perceive. Whether these retrospective accounts accurately reflect his actual childhood experience, or whether they have been shaped by the needs of the narrative he has constructed around himself, is impossible to say with certainty. What we can say is that the story of David Icke's youth, as he tells it, has all the structural features of the hero's origin: the ordinary beginning, the sense of difference, the promise of a destiny not yet revealed. He did not go to university. He left school at 15, and his first attempt at a career of any significance was in professional football. He was a goalkeeper, and by all accounts, a technically proficient one, playing for Coventry City and then Hereford United in the late 1960s and early 1970s. His playing career was ended by rheumatoid arthritis, a condition that arrived when he was in his early 20s and that, by his own description, was agonizing and ultimately debilitating. It is worth pausing here because the arthritis matters. The physical suffering of those years, the way his body turned against him at the moment when his identity was most bound up in its performance, is something Icke has returned to repeatedly in his writing. It planted in him, he has said, the first seeds of his conviction that the medical establishment could not be trusted, that the official explanations for human suffering were inadequate, that there had to be something more fundamental underlying the physical world of symptoms and diagnoses. He would eventually arrive, through a long and winding intellectual journey, at the conclusion that autoimmune diseases like his arthritis were related to the energetic conditions of the body's interaction with its environment, including the deliberate energetic suppression imposed by those who controlled the system. But that conclusion was decades away. In the early 1970s, what the arthritis gave him was simply a reason to leave football and find another way to exist in the world. He found that way in broadcasting. Icke became a journalist, working first for local newspapers and radio stations, and then gravitating toward television. He was talented, presentable, and possessed of a quality that the camera rewards: the ability to project sincerity. He joined the BBC as a sports correspondent and became a familiar face on British television through the 1980s, most prominently as a presenter on the BBC sports show Grandstand. He was also, during this period, a spokesman for the British Green Party, and he threw himself into environmental politics with a convert's intensity. His work for the Greens was serious and substantive. He campaigned against nuclear power, against the destruction of natural habitats, against what he saw as the blind dedication of the political and economic mainstream to a model of development that was destroying the planet. He was, in other words, a mainstream public figure with mainstream concerns, and there was nothing in his public profile through the 1980s that would have predicted what was about to happen. What happened is that David Icke had, depending on your perspective, either a profound spiritual awakening or some form of mental health crisis, or both simultaneously, or something for which neither of those frameworks is quite adequate. He describes the beginning of it as a series of increasingly intense experiences in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a growing sense that he was being guided, that messages were coming to him from somewhere outside ordinary consciousness, that a force or entity or intelligence was communicating with him through events and coincidences, and an internal voice that he came to call his higher self, or later later, infinite consciousness. He visited a psychic healer named Betty Shine, who told him, he says, that he was on the verge of being used as a channel for great messages to the world. He visited a sacred site in Peru and felt, he has described, that the earth was communicating with him through the ground beneath his feet, a literal physical sensation of energy running up through his body. He began reading voraciously in esoteric literature, theosophy, the works of Alice Bailey, Helena Blavatsky, the channelings of Ramtha, the scholarship of Zechariah Sitchin, the alternative archaeology of Graham Hancock. He was building, piece by piece, a cosmological framework that would eventually contain the reptilian theory, though in these early years, the framework was still taking shape. The moment of public rupture came on March 29, 1991, when Icky appeared on the BBC chat show Wogan, one of the most popular programs on British television, hosted by the affable Irish broadcaster Terry Wogan. Icky had by this point begun wearing exclusively turquoise, a color he believed carried special spiritual significance. He had also begun making public statements, claiming that he was the son of the Godhead, that he was a channel for cosmic truth, that the world was approaching a moment of catastrophic transformation, and that he had been chosen to help humanity navigate it. The Wogan appearance was a public spectacle of the most uncomfortable variety. Wogan, a professional charmer with a studio audience primed for warm entertainment, was not equipped for what Icky delivered. Icky spoke with complete apparent seriousness and no apparent awareness of how he was being received, about his cosmic mission, about the messages he was receiving, about the role he had been given to play in the awakening of humanity. The audience laughed. Not the polite, nervous laughter of people unsure whether they are missing a joke, but the full-throated, contemptuous laughter of an audience that has decided it is watching a public breakdown and finds it simultaneously amusing and slightly tragic. It is one of the most watched clips in British broadcasting history, and it launched David Icke's second career. He has said, in the years since, that the Wogan appearance destroyed him temporarily and liberated him permanently. The BBC naturally ended its relationship with him. His marriage was in crisis. His Green Party colleagues distanced themselves. The people who had known him as a credible journalist and political spokesperson were either embarrassed by him or genuinely concerned about his mental state. He lost, essentially overnight, the entire social structure of his previous life. What he gained was the freedom of having nothing left to lose. From that moment, he could say anything because the worst that could happen, the humiliation and professional destruction and social exile, had already happened. And in that freedom, he began to write. The books came quickly. Truth Vibrations in 1991, The Robots' Rebellion in 1994, and The Truth Shall Set You Free in 1995, The Biggest Secret in 1999. Each book was longer and more elaborate than the last, each one building further on the framework he was assembling, each one adding new layers of conspiracy, new nodes of the network, new historical evidence for the hidden controlling elite that he was increasingly certain lay behind every major event in human history. He was, in these years, an extraordinarily industrious researcher. That word, researcher, requires qualification because Icky's research methodology does not conform to any scholarly standard. He reads voraciously and uncritically, accepting anything that supports his framework while dismissing contradictions as deliberate disinformation. He synthesizes freely across sources that have no academic credibility alongside sources that do, presenting the hybrid result as unified evidence. He relies heavily on the testimony of individuals who claim to be whistleblowers or survivors of elite abuse, testimony that is impossible to verify and that he does not attempt to verify by any rigorous standard. But he is genuinely industrious, and the sheer accumulation of material in his books creates an overwhelming effect. When you have read 700 pages of interconnected claims, cross-referenced with hundreds of other sources, the architecture of the argument, regardless of its logical validity, begins to feel substantial simply through its weight. The turn toward reptilians came in The Biggest Secret, published in 1999. This was not the first time anyone had written about reptilian beings and their relationship to human history and human power. The notion of reptilian beings as a hidden presence in human affairs had been circulating in esoteric literature for decades. particularly in the works of Zecharia Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-American author who translated ancient Sumerian texts as evidence that extraterrestrial beings he called the Anunnaki had genetically engineered humanity as a slave race. Sitchin's work was not about reptiles specifically, but it established the template of the ancient alien intervention narrative that Icke would elaborate and modify. Robert Temple's 1976 book, The Serious Mystery, similarly argued for ancient extraterrestrial contact on the basis of the astronomical knowledge of the Dogon people of West Africa. Barbara Marciniak's Bringers of the Dawn, published in 1992, presented itself as a channeled communication from beings who identified themselves as the Pleiadians and warned of malevolent reptilian entities who had hijacked human consciousness. Icke read all of this material and much more like it, and what he produced in The Biggest Secret was a synthesis that for the first time connected the ancient alien narrative directly and specifically to the identifiable faces of contemporary power. The Biggest Secret named names. It named the British royal family, specifically Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles and the broader Windsor bloodline, as reptilian hybrids. It named the Rothschild banking family. It named George H.W. Bush and the Bush family generally. It named Henry Kissinger. It named Bill Clinton. It named a roster of figures that corresponded almost precisely to the cast of characters in traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy literature, which is something we will examine in considerable detail shortly, and which is perhaps the most important fact about the reptilian theory. The book also contained accounts from individuals who claimed to have witnessed high-ranking public figures physically transform into reptilian form during ritual ceremonies. The most prominent of these accounts came from a woman in Arizona named Arizona Wilder, who claimed to have participated as a priestess in satanic reptilian rituals conducted by members of the British royal family, the Rothschild family, and various other high-profile individuals. The specific character of these rituals, involving blood drinking, child sacrifice, and sexual abuse, was presented by Icke as evidence that the ruling elite's inhuman nature expressed itself in inhuman practices whose function was to generate the suffering and fear that the reptilian entities required as sustenance. The response to The Biggest Secret was, predictably, enormous, not enormous in the mainstream sense, where critics might have engaged seriously with the claims. The mainstream response was dismissal and contempt. But in the emerging online world of the late 1990s, where communities of people interested in conspiracy, alternative history, and paranormal phenomena had been forming in the new groups and early web forums since the first days of widespread internet access, the book was a revelation. It gave a name, a face, a mechanism, and a history to something that those communities had been circling around for years. It connected the dots in a way that felt, to people already predisposed to expect hidden connections, satisfyingly complete. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies without a mainstream publisher or a single positive review in a major publication. It was distributed through alternative bookstores, through mail order, through the growing network of conspiracy-focused radio shows and early websites, and eventually through the internet in ways that Icke had not anticipated and could not control, which is to say, it found its audience with the efficiency of a cultural virus precisely calibrated for the hosts it would infect. After The Biggest Secret, Icke's operation grew rapidly. He began touring, not in a van between small venues, though that was how it started, but eventually in theatrical productions of extraordinary scale and duration, 10-hour presentations in major arenas, sold-out performances in London's Wembley Arena, tours of North America, Australia, and Europe. His website became one of the most heavily trafficked conspiracy destinations on the internet. He established a publishing company, Bridge of Love, that allowed him to maintain complete editorial control while generating significant revenue. He hired staff, he developed merchandise, he created a financial ecosystem around the belief system that generated sufficient income to employ a small organization and to fund continuous travel, research, and content production. He was, by any measure, the most successful conspiracy entrepreneur in the world. The business model of David Ickey's operation repays close examination because it illuminates something important about how conspiracy belief functions in the contemporary information economy. Ickey does not pretend to be anything other than what he is, a man who has a view of the world and who wants to share that view as widely as possible. He sells books and DVDs and event tickets and merchandise and, increasingly, digital subscriptions to premium content on his website and later his streaming platform. He is, in economic terms, a media company, one that happens to produce content about shape-shifting reptilian elites rather than about sports or cooking or home renovation. The ethical question that surrounds this economic reality is not simple. Ickey clearly believes what he says. He has sacrificed mainstream credibility, relationships, and periods of significant financial hardship for these beliefs. He is not purely a grifter in the mode of someone who cynically peddles belief they do not hold for profit, but he has also, over the course of 3 decades, built a commercial enterprise that is financially dependent on the perpetuation and amplification of those beliefs, and that creates its own incentive structure independent of the question of sincerity. A man who genuinely believes the world is run by reptilians and who has built a business that generates millions of pounds in annual revenue from that belief has reasons to believe and reasons to want others to believe that go beyond pure epistemology. This dynamic is not unique to Ickey. It is the structural condition of almost every significant conspiracy media operation, but it is worth naming because the conflation of sincere belief and financial incentive is one of the most consistent features of the conspiracy media ecosystem, and it shapes the content that ecosystem produces in ways that are not always visible to consumers of that content. Ickey's worldview evolved continuously through the 2000s and 2010s, absorbing new events and new sources and new directions from his audience. The September 11 attacks became, almost immediately, central to his framework. The attacks were an inside job, he argued, staged by the reptilian global elite as a pretext for the creation of a surveillance and control state. His analysis of 9/11 drew on and amplified the broader 9/11 truth movement, lending it his existing audience of hundreds of thousands, and receiving in return a new influx of people whose first encounter with conspiracy was through the specific trauma of that event. The financial crisis of 2008 gave him another extraordinary opportunity because the actual behavior of financial institutions during that period, the documented fraud, the regulatory capture, the bailouts of institutions that had manufactured the crisis, was so extreme and so infuriating and so inadequately addressed by official accountability mechanisms that it made his broader claims about a predatory elite controlling the financial system feel, to many people, suddenly and powerfully plausible. He added 5G towers to his framework, and vaccine surveillance, and the digital control grid, and the coming cashless society, and each edition expanded his audience because each edition touched a nerve that was live in a portion of the population that had not previously been his. He wrote about the connection between EMF radiation and consciousness suppression. He wrote about the role of fluoride in the public water supply as a mechanism for keeping human consciousness imprisoned. He wrote about the moon as an artificial satellite transmitting a false reality signal into human perception. Each claim is more extraordinary than the last, and yet each one finds takers because the framework is now so well established, the community so large and so socially reinforcing, the distrust of official denial so deeply embedded that the threshold for belief has been lowered almost to zero. He became, during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 2021, the most controversial he had ever been, and the most widely platformed. His initial response to the pandemic, articulated in a lengthy video published in March 2020 that was viewed more than 1 million times before it was removed from YouTube, was that the virus itself was either fictional or vastly exaggerated, that it was being used as a pretext for the imposition of a global control grid, that the proposed vaccines were designed to inject nanotechnology into human bodies in order to create a digital interface between human consciousness and an AI network that the global elite would control. The specific claims were wrong. The virus was real. The vaccines did not contain microchips or nanotechnology in any meaningful sense, but the emotional and political resonance of the claims was enormous because the pandemic had, genuinely and legitimately, produced a situation in which governments around the world were imposing unprecedented restrictions on movement and association, in which the pharmaceutical industry was moving with unusual speed and unusual financial reward, in which official communications were sometimes inconsistent and sometimes demonstrably wrong, and in which the relationship between public health authorities and the economic interests of pharmaceutical companies was receiving more scrutiny than it had for decades. Into that moment of genuine and legitimate uncertainty, Icke's framework arrived with the explanatory completeness of a key fitting a lock. YouTube removed his channel, Facebook removed his pages, Twitter suspended his account. He was, in the language of the platforms, deplatformed. He responded by moving to alternative platforms and framing the deplatforming as proof of everything he had been saying for 30 years. His audience, contrary to what might have been hoped by those who made the deplatforming decisions, did not significantly shrink. It reorganized. It found him on Telegram and Rumble and Odyssey and his own platform, IckeTV.com, and it continued to grow because deplatforming David Icke does not address the conditions that make people want to find David Icke. It just changes which algorithm delivers him to their door. There is something worth understanding about the man himself, beyond the spectacle of his career and the horror of some of his claims. People who have interviewed Icke at length, including journalists who have gone in prepared to be contemptuous, frequently report being surprised by the personal encounter. He is warm, he is patient, he is not the ranting demagogue of the stereotype. He listens carefully, he answers questions fully, he is capable of humor about himself and his situation. He does not project the paranoid brittleness that one might expect from someone who has spent 30 years being publicly ridiculed. He projects instead a serenity that comes from the absolute conviction that he is right. A conviction that functions as armor against every form of criticism. He has been asked, many times, what evidence could change his mind, and his answer is consistently that he follows the evidence wherever it leads, which sounds like the answer of an empiricist, but is in practice the answer of someone for whom the framework is prior to the evidence, for whom the evidence is perpetually reinterpreted to fit the frame. He is, in this sense, a man of genuine faith. Faith in a cosmology that happens to include shape-shifting lizards, but faith nonetheless, with all the certainty and all the imperviousness to doubt that genuine faith provides. He has now been doing this for more than 30 years. He has published more than 20 books, the most recent of which are as thick and as elaborately interconnected as anything in his catalog. He has given hundreds of arena shows on multiple continents. He has influenced, directly or indirectly, the beliefs of tens of millions of people. His fingerprints are on the QAnon framework, which we will examine later, and on the anti-vaccine movement of the 2020s, and on the broader global ecosystem of elite conspiracy belief that has, in the second decade of the 21st century, become a significant factor in the political life of multiple democracies. He has done all of this from the ruins of a conventional career that collapsed in 1991 on a television chat show before an audience that laughed at him. There is a line that Icke uses in his presentations, a line he has been using in various forms since the early 1990s, and it goes something like this: I was either mad then, or I was a voice in the wilderness for things that the world has now accepted. He means this as a rhetorical appeal to the events of subsequent decades as validation of his framework. The claim is false in its specific content, because the events of subsequent decades have not validated the reptilian theory in any meaningful sense, but there is a kernel of something in it that explains why he continues to find an audience. Because the world has genuinely validated the proposition that institutions lie, that official narratives are constructed, that powerful people do conspire and do abuse and do hide things from public scrutiny. Icke was saying that in 1991, more loudly and more colorfully than almost anyone else, and in the decades since, enough has come to light through journalism, through academic research, through whistleblowers and freedom of information requests and congressional investigations to establish that basic proposition as something close to consensus. The problem is that Icke built an enormous and specific structure of claim on that legitimate foundation, a structure that bears no evidentiary weight, but that millions of people inhabit because the foundation feels solid beneath their feet. To understand the full architecture of that structure, we have to go to its deeper origins. We have to go back before David Icke. We have to go back before the internet. We have to go back to the ancient world, where the first stories of shape-shifting beings that moved among humans in disguise were told, and to the long journey those stories made through history before they were assembled into the specific configuration that Icke presents as ancient wisdom. Because the reptilian theory did not spring fully formed from one man's mind, it is, in many respects, a remix, and some of what it remixes is among the most dangerous material in the history of human thought. The deep roots. In the summer of 1903, a Russian newspaper called Znamya, which translates as the Banner, began publishing a serialized text that would become one of the most consequential forgeries in human history. The text was called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it purported to be the minutes of a series of secret meetings held by a council of Jewish leaders at the turn of the century, meetings at which these leaders laid out in granular detail their plan for world domination. Control of the press, control of the financial system, the deliberate corruption of Gentile morality, the manipulation of governments, the construction of a hidden parallel power structure that would eventually subordinate all nations and all peoples to Jewish global rule. The text was not written by Jewish leaders. It was a fabrication assembled by members of the Russian secret police from a variety of earlier sources, most notably a French political satire from 1864 called The Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, in which the figure of Machiavelli lays out a plan for political tyranny that the fabricators simply copied and reattributed to Jewish conspirators. The forgery was crude by the standards of modern document analysis, and it was exposed as a forgery as early as 1921, when the London Times published a meticulous investigation demonstrating its origin point in the earlier French text. It did not matter. The protocols spread across the world with terrifying speed and durability. They were translated into dozens of languages. They were published in millions of copies. Henry Ford serialized excerpts in his newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, and later published them in a book called The International Jew, which was so widely distributed that Adolf Hitler kept a framed portrait of Ford in his office and cited Ford's work in Mein Kampf as an influence on his own thinking. The protocols became the foundational text of a global wave of anti-Semitic violence that culminated, though it did not end, in the Holocaust. We are beginning here because understanding the reptilian conspiracy theory requires understanding the protocols, and not merely as context or background. The reptilian theory is structurally identical to the protocols. It describes, using different terminology, the same phenomenon: a small, hidden group of beings who are not fully human and who have secretly seized control of every major institution on Earth in order to exploit and enslave the human population. The people named in David Icke's books, the banking families, the political dynasties, the media moguls, the royal bloodlines, correspond with remarkable precision to the people identified in traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy literature. And this correspondence is not coincidental. It is the product of a specific and traceable intellectual lineage. The question of whether David Icke is anti-Semitic is one of the most contested in the long and contentious debate about his work. Icke himself has consistently and vehemently denied it. He has stated repeatedly that he does not target Jewish people, that his targets are specific families and bloodlines that happen to include people from many different ethnic and religious backgrounds, that he is opposed to Zionism as a political ideology, but not to Jewish people as a group, and that accusing him of anti-Semitism is a deliberate tactic by the powers he is exposing to deflect criticism by weaponizing the charge of racism. These denials have been accepted by many of his followers and rejected by many scholars, researchers, and Jewish organizations. The Anti-Defamation League has classified Icke's work as anti-Semitic. The Board of Deputies of British Jews has made the same classification. A range of academic researchers who study contemporary anti-Semitism have reached the same conclusion. The most careful scholarly treatment of the question was provided by the political scientist Michael Barkin in his 2003 book, A Culture of Conspiracy, and more recently by the researcher David Aronovich in Voodoo Histories, both of whom argue that the reptilian framework functions as what Barkin calls a stigmatized knowledge synthesis. It takes the structure of classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory and translates it into a register that allows its basic claims to be made while maintaining deniability about their target. The mechanism by which this works is worth examining carefully because it is more sophisticated than simple substitution. Icky does not say that Jewish people control the world. He says that the reptilian bloodlines control the world, and he says that these bloodlines include many people who identify as Jewish, particularly the Rothschild family, whom he has at various points described as Rothschildian, implying a hybrid category that is simultaneously Jewish and reptilian. He also says that the reptilian bloodlines include people who are Christian, people who are nominally Muslim, people who identify with no religion at all. He says that what these people have in common is not ethnicity or religion, but genetic inheritance, a reptilian bloodline that predates and supersedes any human cultural identity. This framing achieves several things simultaneously. It allows Icky to name Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and the State of Israel as key nodes in the conspiracy while maintaining that he is not targeting Jews, because he is targeting something that transcends Jewishness. It allows followers who are genuinely not anti-Semitic to engage with the framework without recognizing its anti-Semitic function, and it provides a layer of deniability that makes legal action and platform enforcement more difficult, because the specific claim is always about reptilians or bloodlines rather than about Jewish people per se. But the deniability collapses under scrutiny because the list of families and individuals identified as reptilian hybrids in Icky's work tracks the list of families and individuals identified as Jewish global controllers in the protocols and in subsequent anti-Semitic literature with a fidelity that cannot be explained by coincidence. Because the specific characteristics attributed to the reptilian elite, the absence of normal human empathy, the secret ritual practices, the blood consumption, the sexual abuse of children, the deliberate engineering of human suffering for sustenance, replicate almost point for point the blood libel narratives that have been used to justify the massacre of Jewish communities since the medieval period. Because Icky has repeatedly cited sources that are themselves explicitly anti-Semitic, including the protocols directly in some early editions of his work, before he modified the attribution, including Eustace Mullins, an American white nationalist whose writing explicitly identified Jewish bankers as the controllers of the Federal Reserve, and including the Illuminati bloodlines research of Fritz Springmeier, whose work is deeply embedded in Christian identity ideology and its associated anti-Semitism, because in the absence of any other explanation, the simplest account of the correspondence between the reptilian target list and the traditional anti-Semitic target list is that one is a mutation of the other. This matters not as an abstract question of attribution, but as a practical question of consequence. When conspiracy theory targets Jews, it kills Jews. This is not hyperbole. It is the documented historical record. The Pittsburgh Synagogue Massacre of 2018, in which 11 people were killed, was committed by a man whose online statements showed deep engagement with the kind of elite Jewish control conspiracy theory that overlaps structurally with the reptilian framework. The Poway Synagogue shooting of 2019, the Buffalo supermarket shooting of 2022, the Halle Synagogue attack in Germany in 2019, all were committed by individuals whose stated ideological frameworks drew on the same wellspring of hidden controller anti-Semitism in various registers and at various levels of abstraction. The men who committed these murders were not all David Icke readers, but they were shaped by an information environment in which variants of the same basic conspiracy, the secret controlling elite that is not fully human and that preys on ordinary people, circulate at enormous scale, and in which the identification of that elite with Jewish people specifically, whether made explicitly or coded as reptilians or globalists or Zionists, is a continuous background signal. We need to go further back than the protocols, because the architecture of the hidden controller narrative predates them by centuries. The idea of a secret group of beings who appear human but are fundamentally different, who live among the population in disguise, who pursue agendas hostile to ordinary human well-being, and who have infiltrated the most powerful institutions of the society, is one of the most durable structures in human mythological thinking. It appears in ancient Sumerian mythology, in the figure of the Anunnaki, the beings who descended from the sky to create humanity as a servant race. It appears in Gnostic Christianity, in the figure of the archons, described in certain Gnostic texts as demonic entities that created the material world as a prison for divine sparks of consciousness that feed on human suffering and that masquerade as the gods worshipped by conventional religion. It appears in a wide range of indigenous traditions around the world, in stories of shape-shifting beings that can take human form, that interbreed with humans, that have special knowledge and special powers that they use to manipulate the human world. It appears in medieval Christian theology in the figure of the devil and his agents, beings of disguise and deception who have penetrated every level of human society and who must be rooted out and destroyed. What David Icke did, and what makes him important as an intellectual figure regardless of the truth value of his claims, was to synthesize these ancient mythological structures with the specific contemporary content of modern conspiracy literature, and with the frameworks of alternative science and consciousness research to produce a coherent, elaborately detailed, internally consistent narrative architecture that felt both ancient and urgently modern. He told people that the stories their ancestors had told about hidden non-human controllers were not myths. They were memories. They were encoded knowledge passed down through thousands of years of oral tradition and sacred text, knowledge that the controlling forces had done their best to suppress and distort, but that could still be recovered and decoded by anyone willing to look carefully enough. This is an extraordinarily powerful rhetorical move because it takes the considerable authority of ancient tradition and conscripts it in service of a modern political claim. When Icke tells you that the Anunnaki described in Sumerian clay tablets are the same entities as the reptilian bloodline families that run the world today, he is doing something that no amount of fact-checking can easily address, because he is operating in a register where the epistemological standards of fact-checking do not apply. He is telling a myth about the truth of myths, and myths are not falsified by evidence, they are sustained by resonance. The scholar of religion Wouter Hanegraaff, in his magisterial study Esotericism and the Academy, describes the tradition from which Icke draws as a form of rejected knowledge, a body of claims and interpretations that has been consistently marginalized by the mainstream of Western intellectual culture since the Enlightenment, and that has therefore developed a relationship to mainstream knowledge that is simultaneously parasitic and adversarial. It borrows from mainstream science and history selectively, using the authority of those disciplines where they appear to support the framework, while rejecting them categorically where they do not. This is not unique to the reptilian theory. It is the standard epistemological condition of esoteric thought, and Icke operates squarely within it. But Icke also brought something that traditional esotericism lacked: specificity. Classical esoteric writing tends toward abstraction. It speaks of cosmic forces, of planes of being, of initiatic hierarchies, of the perennial philosophy that underlies all traditions. Icke speaks of specific families, specific individuals, specific bloodlines, specific mechanisms of control. He names the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Windsors and the Bushes. He names specific dates and specific events. He draws genealogical charts. He cross-references financial records. He points to specific logos and specific artworks and specific architectural details as evidence of the hidden power's self-expression. This specificity is what distinguishes his work from the broader esoteric tradition and what makes it politically dangerous in a way that, say, theosophical writing is not. A book about the archons as cosmic entities of consciousness is not a template for violence. A book that names specific Jewish families as the secret controllers of the world's financial system, even if those families are also described as reptilian, has historical precedent as a template for exactly that. The bloodline research that forms a significant strand of Ickey's work draws heavily on the work of a Canadian author named Fritz Springmeier, who published a series of books beginning in the 1990s, claiming to document the genealogical connections between what he called the 13 Illuminati bloodlines and the families that exercise hidden global control. Springmeier's work is explicitly rooted in Christian identity theology, a white supremacist religious movement that interprets the Bible as teaching that white Europeans are the true Israelites and that Jewish people are either imposters or literally the children of the devil. Springmeier was convicted of armed robbery in 2001 and has been consistently associated with far-right and white nationalist movements throughout his career. Ickey does not explicitly endorse Christian identity theology, and he has distanced himself from Springmeier's more explicit racism, but the bloodline genealogies that appear in his work, the charts of interconnected family trees linking medieval European royalty to modern banking families, are substantially derived from Springmeier's research and carry, embedded within them, the specific ideological architecture of that tradition. A similar relationship exists between Ickey's work and that of Eustace Mullins, an American author who was a protege of the fascist poet Ezra Pound and who spent his career writing explicitly anti-Semitic analyses of the Federal Reserve, the Council on Foreign Relations, and other institutions of American elite power. Mullins's central argument that the American financial system is controlled by a network of Jewish international bankers who use it to extract wealth from the American people appears in Ickey's work transposed into the Reptilian Register. The financial control is there, the same institutions are identified, the same mechanisms of exploitation are described, but the word Jewish has been replaced with reptilian bloodline. Whether Ickey did this consciously or whether he absorbed the framework from Mullins's sources without recognizing its anti-Semitic content is a question that only Ickey himself could answer, and his answer, consistently, has been the latter. He says he opposes prejudice in any form, but the bones of the argument are the same bones, regardless of the flesh that covers them. There is also the matter of the specific conspiracy about child trafficking and satanic ritual abuse that runs through Ickey's work and through the broader elite conspiracy ecosystem that it has seeded. This strand of the theory connects to what researchers call satanic panic, a cluster of allegations that spread through the United States and the United Kingdom in the 1980s and early 1990s, alleging that networks of Satanists were systematically abusing and murdering children in daycare centers, churches, and other institutions. These allegations, despite producing hundreds of criminal prosecutions, were overwhelmingly not supported by evidence, and many of those prosecutions were subsequently reversed. The investigations conducted by journalists, psychologists, and law enforcement in the aftermath of the Satanic Panic established that the allegations had been generated primarily through suggestive interviewing techniques applied to young children, and that there was no evidence of the organized satanic networks that had been alleged. This specific history of false accusation and the ruined lives it produced did not, however, prevent the satanic abuse narrative from being incorporated into the reptilian conspiracy framework, where it found a new and energized life. Ickey's claim that the reptilian elite conducts ritual abuse of children, including murder and blood consumption, as part of their energy-generating practices, is among the most harmful specific claims in his body of work. Not because it is more false than his other claims, but because it has the most direct real-world consequences. Accusations of child abuse are the most powerful social weapon available in contemporary society. They are almost impossible to disprove because the absence of evidence for an alleged hidden practice can always be attributed to the extraordinary effectiveness of the cover-up. They activate the deepest protective instincts of the population, and they have, historically, been the specific form of false accusation most reliably used to generate mass violence against targeted groups. The blood libel accusations against Jewish communities in medieval Europe, the witch trial accusations of the early modern period, the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, and the QAnon framework of the 2010s are all variations on the same structure, in which an accusation of harm to children is used to mobilize a population against a targeted enemy. The QAnon phenomenon is the most recent and in some ways the most virulent mutation of the Reptilian Elite framework, We will examine QAnon in greater detail in the next section of this documentary, but it is worth noting here that QAnon's founding myth that the American political and cultural elite runs a network of child trafficking and sacrifice that serves its occult and vampiric needs is a direct descendant of the Icky framework, which is itself a direct descendant of the protocols and the blood libel tradition. The specific innovation of QAnon was to inject this ancient structure with the interactive mechanisms of the internet, creating a community of participatory investigators who felt they were collectively decoding the evidence of the crime in real time. This interactive format, more than any specific claim, is what made QAnon explosively viral. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the present, we need to spend more time with the ancient. Because the reptilian mythology that Icky draws on is not purely a modern confection. It reaches back to traditions that are genuinely very old, and understanding those traditions, understanding what they were actually about before Icky repurposed them, is essential to understanding both the appeal of the theory and the specific way in which that appeal has been exploited. Ancient Sumerian mythology does describe beings who came from elsewhere and who interacted with early human civilization. The Anunnaki are real figures in Sumerian religious literature, complex divine beings whose relationships with humanity are multifaceted and whose moral valence shifts across different texts and different periods of Sumerian religious thought. Zecharia Sitchin, whose translations of these texts provided much of the raw material for the ancient alien narrative that Icky builds on, was not a credentialed Sumerian scholar, and his translations have been rejected by every accredited Assyriologist who has examined them. The actual Sumerian texts, when read by people who can actually read Sumerian, do not say what Sitchin claimed they said. They describe a rich and complex religious cosmology that has no more relationship to literal extraterrestrial visitation than the Greek myths have to literal Olympian gods. But Sitchin's readings, precisely because they are wrong and precisely because they transform the symbolic into the literal, feel more immediate, more relevant, more like an exposure of suppressed truth than the careful and provisional readings of professional scholars. The same dynamic applies to Icky's use of Gnostic material. The Gnostic texts, particularly those discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, do describe archons, and they do frame the material world as a kind of prison, and they do attribute to the demiurge, the creator of the material world, a predatory and deceptive character. These are genuine features of genuine ancient texts, and they are fascinating and profound in their own right. But the Gnostic tradition is not a literal cosmological report on the nature of the universe. It is a sophisticated philosophical and spiritual response to the problem of evil and the paradox of suffering in a world supposedly created by a benevolent deity. Reading it as literal history, as a record of actual entities who actually control actual human institutions, is not a recovery of ancient wisdom. It is a misreading so complete as to constitute a different text entirely. The ancient traditions of shapeshifting are similarly complex and similarly misrepresented. Virtually every culture on Earth has stories of beings who can change form: werewolves, selkies, kitsune, nagwals, skinwalkers, jinn who appear in human form. These are almost universally understood by the scholars who study them as metaphorical or ritual figures, as representations of the permeability of the boundary between the human and the non-human, between the social and the wild, between the ordinary and the sacred. They are not, in any tradition where they originate, understood as political claims about the identities of specific ruling families. The transformation of these mythological traditions into political conspiracy is entirely modern, entirely Western, and entirely the product of the specific intellectual lineage we have been tracing. The lineage runs from the medieval blood libel, through the 18th century Illuminati panic, through the 19th century protocols, through the mid-20th century paranoid style of American politics, through the late 20th century alternative spirituality movement to David Icke, who synthesized all of it into the specific form that now circulates at global scale. At each step, the fundamental structure remained the same. A hidden group of beings who are not like us, who live among us in disguise, who have taken control of our institutions, who feed on our suffering, and who must be exposed and stopped. What changed at each step was the specific dress in which that structure was clothed, the specific targets identified as the hidden group, and the specific mechanisms proposed for the exposure and the stopping. What did not change at any step was the consequence. When this structure is deployed against real people, in history and in the present, those real people are targeted for hatred, discrimination, and violence. The abstract enemy, the shape-shifting bloodline family, the reptilian hybrid, the satanic pedophile, becomes, in the minds and hands of those who act on these beliefs, a specific human being who can be stalked, threatened, harassed, or murdered. This happened to Comet Ping Pong, a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., whose owner and employees were subjected to years of harassment, death threats, and ultimately a shooting when a man decided to self-investigate the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that alleged the restaurant was the site of a pedophile network run by Democratic Party operatives. It happened to Bill Gates, who received death threats at a scale that required significant security escalation when he became a primary target of pandemic-era conspiracy theory. It happens to the Rothschild family, who have experienced a continuous barrage of threats and harassment that directly tracks the volume and intensity of reptilian and elite conspiracy content across the internet. It happened, most catastrophically, to the 11 people murdered in Pittsburgh in 2018 and the countless thousands who have been killed in history by the same structure of accusation clothed in different historical dress. The roots of the reptilian theory are deep, and they reach into some of the darkest soil in human history. That is not a reason to refuse to examine them. It is the most urgent possible reason to do so, because a theory that is growing, that is accelerating, that has achieved genuine mass appeal in the most powerful democracies on Earth in the second decade of the 21st century cannot be wished away or laughed away or deplatformed away. It can only be confronted, which means it must first be understood. The next question is why? Not why historically, which we have addressed, but why psychologically? Why does this specific structure of thought, with its ancient roots and its documented capacity for violence, remain so compelling to so many people in a moment when we have more access to more verified information than at any previous point in human history? The answer to that question lies not in the stars and not in the Sumerian tablets, but in the architecture of the human mind itself and in the specific social and political conditions that have created the 21st century's extraordinary appetite for the thing that these ancient structures provide. The psychology. There is an experiment that has been conducted in various forms in social psychology laboratories around the world since the 1960s, and its results are consistently unsettling to people who believe that human beings are primarily rational actors who update their beliefs in response to evidence. In the experiment, participants are shown a series of images and asked to identify patterns. Some of the images contain genuine patterns, and some are pure noise. Random distributions of visual information with no underlying structure, consistently, reliably, across cultures and demographics and levels of education and intelligence. Human beings identify patterns in both the signal and the noise. They see faces in clouds. They see meaningful shapes in random dot distributions. They hear words in static. This tendency, which psychologists call apophenia, the spontaneous perception of connections and patterns in unrelated things, is not a malfunction of human cognition. It is one of its most fundamental and most valuable features. Pattern recognition is what allows us to learn from experience, to predict the future from the past, to navigate a world that is genuinely full of patterns, causal relationships, regular sequences of events that would be catastrophically difficult to navigate by purely reactive means. But pattern recognition does not come with an off switch. The same cognitive machinery that allows you to recognize that the rustling in the bushes might be a predator and therefore to respond appropriately before you have had time to reason through the evidence carefully is the machinery that sees a face in a piece of toast or a conspiracy in a sequence of unrelated events. Evolution has tuned this machinery in a particular direction, toward false positives rather than false negatives, toward seeing patterns that are not there rather than missing patterns that are there. This is because in the ancestral environment of human evolution, the cost of a false positive, Fleeing from a rustle that turned out to be the wind was low. The cost of a false negative, ignoring a rustle that turned out to be a leopard, was potentially fatal. The result is that human brains are systematically biased toward finding agency, intention, and pattern in the world, including in events and data that contain no genuine pattern or agency. This bias, which researchers call the Hyperactive Agency Detection Device, or HADD, is one of the foundational cognitive underpinnings of both religious belief and conspiracy belief. When something bad happens, the mind reaches for an agent who caused it. When a pattern of events seems too consistent to be accidental, the mind reaches for an intentional designer. When powerful people make decisions that harm ordinary people, the mind reaches for the explanation that the harm was intended, that there is a plan, that the bad outcomes are the goals rather than the side effects of systems operating in morally indifferent ways. This is not stupidity, it is the ordinary operation of human cognition in the context of information environments that our cognition was not designed to navigate. The cognitive underpinnings of conspiracy belief extend well beyond pattern recognition. A second major factor is what psychologists call proportionality bias, the tendency to assume that large events must have large causes. This bias is deeply intuitive and often correct because in the evolutionary environment, large effects tend to be produced by significant causes, not by trivial ones, but it systematically fails when applied to complex systems where catastrophic large-scale events can result from small, mundane, cascading failures. The September 11th attacks, which were carried out by 19 people armed with box cutters and motivated by a specific political and religious ideology, produced consequences so enormous that many people found it cognitively inadequate to attribute them to anything so mundane. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., events of such historical magnitude that they changed the trajectory of American history, feel cognitively disproportionate when attributed to lone gunmen with personal or ideological motivations. A world war, a financial collapse, a pandemic, a climate catastrophe. Events of such scale feel, to the proportionality-biased brain, as though they must be the products of deliberate planning at a correspondingly vast scale. The conspiracy framework satisfies this intuition. It says that the large events have large causes. A hidden organization of extraordinary power, ancient and far-sighted and nearly omnipotent, has planned and executed these events for purposes that serve its interests. The scale of the cause matches the scale of the effect. A third factor, perhaps the most important for understanding the specific dynamics of reptilian conspiracy belief, is what researchers call epistemic anxiety, the distress that arises from uncertainty and from the inability to explain significant events. Human beings are remarkably uncomfortable with randomness and meaninglessness. We are narrative animals, creatures who understand ourselves and our world primarily through story, and the need for narrative is not merely aesthetic or intellectual. It is psychological. The absence of adequate narrative, the experience of events that seem to have no meaning, no moral structure, no comprehensible cause, is genuinely distressing in a way that goes beyond intellectual frustration. And in the contemporary world, epistemic anxiety is at extraordinary levels. We live in conditions of accelerating complexity, in which the systems that govern our lives, financial systems, technological systems, political systems, ecological systems, are too vast and too intricate for any individual to comprehend. We live with levels of economic insecurity, physical health anxiety, social disruption, and exposure to traumatic events through media consumption that generate chronic low-level distress as a background condition of daily existence. And we live with institutions that have demonstrably failed, repeatedly and consequentially, to perform their stated functions of protecting and serving the populations they claim to serve. In this context, conspiracy theory performs a specific and powerful psychological function. It resolves epistemic anxiety by replacing complexity with explanation. It transforms the experience of living in a world that is confusing and frightening and apparently indifferent to human well-being into the experience of living in a world that is controlled and intentional and hostile, but at least comprehensible. Psychologically, there is a significant difference between these two experiences. A world governed by indifferent chaos is one in which the individual has no particular role to play and no particular action to take. A world governed by a hidden controlling elite is one in which the individual who perceives the truth has a vital role to play. The role of the awake person in a world of sleepers, the whistleblower, the resistance fighter, the person who knows. This role, the person who knows, is one of the most psychologically rewarding available in the repertoire of human self-definition. It provides a sense of superiority over those who do not see what you see. It provides a sense of mission, a reason to get up in the morning and research and talk and share and recruit. It provides community with others who have also taken on this role, community that is often warmer and more validating than the communities from which conspiracy belief has separated the believer. And it provides a coherent personal narrative, a story about who you are and why you are the way you are and why the world has treated you as it has. For people who have experienced marginalization, economic hardship, social exclusion, or trauma, this narrative is particularly compelling because it relocates the causes of one's difficult circumstances from the personal to the political and the conspiratorial. It is not that you have made bad choices or been unlucky or been disadvantaged by systems of class or race or gender that operate without deliberate malice. It is that the system is deliberately arranged against people like you, by entities that profit from your suffering. The agency this attributes to the enemy is also, paradoxically, the agency it attributes to the victim. If you know what is being done to you, you are no longer entirely its object. The psychologist Jan Willem van Prooijen, who has done some of the most careful empirical work on the psychology of conspiracy belief, identifies several factors that consistently predict susceptibility to conspiracy theories. One is a lack of perceived control over one's own circumstances, the sense that external forces determine the outcomes of one's life. Another is the experience of social exclusion or marginalization. A third is what van Prooijen calls the need for cognitive closure, the desire for clear, definite answers as opposed to ambiguity and uncertainty. A fourth is the experience of what he calls pattern perception under uncertainty, the tendency to see patterns in ambiguous data more readily than average. None of these factors are pathological. Each of them is a comprehensible response to specific life circumstances. Together, they describe not a type of person who is broken or weak or stupid, but a type of person who has been shaped by specific experiences, who has specific psychological needs, and who has encountered a framework that addresses those needs with apparently satisfying completeness. The social dimension of conspiracy belief deserves particular attention because it is often underweighted in accounts that focus exclusively on individual psychology. Conspiracy communities are, for their members, genuinely communities. They provide belonging, mutual support, shared purpose, and social recognition in a way that can be deeply meaningful to people who are isolated or alienated from mainstream social structures. Research on online conspiracy communities has consistently found that the social dimension, the experience of being part of a group that sees what others cannot see, that is engaged in important work that the world needs but is not yet ready to hear, is often more motivationally powerful than the specific content of the beliefs. People do not primarily stay in conspiracy communities because they are convinced by the evidence. They stay because they have made friends, found meaning, and constructed an identity within those communities, and because leaving would require them to forfeit all of that, along with the beliefs. This social embeddedness is also what makes conspiracy belief so resistant to the kind of direct information correction that well-meaning educators and journalists and family members attempt. When a person holds a conspiracy belief that is embedded in a social community, challenging that belief is not experienced as offering them better information. It is experienced as attacking their community, their identity, and their sense of meaningful purpose. The defensive response that results is not irrational. It is the ordinary human response to social threat, which is more powerful and more immediate than the response to informational challenge. Researchers who study de-radicalization have found consistently that the most effective approaches to helping people exit conspiracy communities are not argument-based but relationship-based, offering alternative social connections, alternative sources of meaning and purpose, alternative communities that can provide what the conspiracy community provides without the beliefs that accompany it. This is slow, expensive, labor-intensive work that cannot be scaled to the millions of people who have been absorbed by these communities, which is part of why the problem continues to grow. There is a specific feature of the reptilian conspiracy framework that makes it particularly powerful psychologically, and that is its totality. Many conspiracy theories explain specific events, a specific assassination, a specific terrorist attack, a specific policy failure. The reptilian theory explains everything. It is what researchers call a grand unifying conspiracy theory, a framework so comprehensive that it can accommodate any event, any piece of information, any development, and fit it into the narrative. The election of any politician can be explained within the framework, whether their election represents the advancement of the reptilian agenda or the appearance of resistance that is itself controlled opposition. Any scientific finding can be accommodated. Findings that support the theory are authentic. Findings that challenge it are manufactured disinformation. Any new technology can be incorporated. 5G towers are part of the control grid. Vaccines are delivery mechanisms for surveillance nanotechnology. Smartphones are consciousness suppression devices. The theory is unfalsifiable, not because it has been designed to be so by a malevolent theorist, but because any sufficiently comprehensive framework that attributes all observable phenomena to a single hidden cause will be structurally unfalsifiable by the nature of the claim. This unfalsifiability is not experienced as a weakness by believers. It is experienced as evidence of the theory's truth, because a true account of a real conspiracy would naturally be confirmed by everything, because everything really is connected. The philosopher Karl Popper defined the falsifiability of a claim as the mark of its scientific status. A claim that cannot be falsified, that is consistent with any possible observation, is not a scientific claim. It is, in Popper's framework, a metaphysical claim, a claim about the world that operates outside the rules of evidence and therefore cannot be adjudicated by evidence. Popper applied this analysis specifically to Freudian psychoanalysis and to Marxism as it was practiced in the early 20th century, noting that both frameworks were constructed in such a way that any possible event could be accommodated as confirmation. The reptilian conspiracy framework has exactly this quality, and Popper's insight explains why it is so extraordinarily resistant to factual challenge. You cannot falsify it because it has already incorporated the possibility of any attempt at falsification into itself. The falsification attempts are the conspiracy's most powerful tool. The role of the internet in amplifying and accelerating these dynamics cannot be overstated, and it operates through mechanisms that are more specific and more troubling than the general observation that the internet makes it easier to find like-minded people. The recommendation algorithms that govern the major platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and their successors, are optimization functions. They are designed to maximize engagement, which means they are designed to serve content that produces strong emotional reactions, that generates comments and shares, and extended viewing time, and that brings people back to the platform repeatedly. Content that produces conspiracy belief does all of these things with remarkable efficiency. It is emotionally activating, it is novel, it is morally charged, it provides a sense of mission that motivates repeated engagement, and it creates a sense of community that makes the platform a social space rather than merely an information space. The algorithm does not prefer conspiracy content because a conspiracy theorist designed the algorithm. It prefers conspiracy content because conspiracy content is extraordinarily good at doing what the algorithm is trying to do, which is to maximize the time people spend on the platform. The result is what researchers call the rabbit hole effect, the phenomenon by which engagement with moderate, skeptical, or heterodox content on a platform leads, through algorithmic recommendation, through a sequence of small escalations, to engagement with increasingly extreme content. A person who watches a documentary about financial inequality is recommended videos about central banking. Videos about central banking recommend videos about the Federal Reserve. Videos about the Federal Reserve recommend videos about the Rothschilds. Videos about the Rothschilds recommend videos about Illuminati bloodlines. Videos about Illuminati bloodlines recommend David Icke. Each step in the sequence is a small escalation from the previous one, small enough that the viewer does not experience a jarring discontinuity, small enough that the motion toward the extreme edge feels like a natural progression of inquiry rather than a departure into a different epistemic universe. By the time the viewer arrives at videos about shape-shifting reptilians, they have traveled, step by step, through a gradient of escalating claim, and each previous step has shifted the baseline of normal so that each subsequent step feels less extreme. The research on this rabbit hole effect has been somewhat contested, with some researchers arguing that the algorithmic role in radicalization has been overstated and that people who end up consuming extreme content were already predisposed to seek it out. But even the researchers who argue against simple algorithmic determinism agree that platforms amplify and accelerate pathways that would exist in some form without them, and that the specific content recommendations that algorithms provide create a structured environment of escalation that would be difficult to replicate through any other means. The argument about how much of the responsibility for radicalization belongs to algorithms and how much to prior individual disposition is less important than the observation that both factors are real and that their interaction produces effects that exceed what either could produce alone. There is also the question of what the internet has done to the information environment itself, beyond the algorithmic dynamics. The multiplication of information sources that the internet has produced has had a paradoxical effect on the relationship between volume of information and confidence in truth claims. Classical information theory would predict that more information leads to better calibration of beliefs, because more information provides more opportunity for false claims to be disconfirmed. But in practice, the proliferation of information sources has produced what researchers call epistemic fragmentation, the breakdown of the shared information environment that is the precondition for public reasoning together about what is true. When every claim can find supporting sources and every supporting source can be made to look authoritative, the traditional mechanisms by which individuals calibrate their beliefs, deference to expertise, assessment of source credibility, triangulation across independent sources, become extremely difficult to apply. People fall back on motivated reasoning. They find sources that confirm what they already believe, assess those sources as credible, and experience the existence of those sources as confirmation of their beliefs. In this environment, conspiracy belief is not a departure from normal epistemic behavior. It is normal epistemic behavior applied to an information environment in which the usual shortcuts for distinguishing reliable from unreliable information have broken down. The person who believes in reptilian elites because they have found 300 websites, 4 YouTube channels, 12 books, and a community of thousands of people who agree with them is not reasoning poorly by the standards of the environment they inhabit. They are reasoning as most people reason, which is to say through social proof and motivated processing rather than through rigorous individual evaluation of primary evidence. The difference is not in the reasoning process, but in the starting point. They began their inquiry already predisposed by experience or temperament or social embedding to reach a particular destination, and the information environment they inhabit was built to make sure they reached it. The therapeutic and clinical literature on conspiracy belief is smaller than it should be, given the scale of the phenomenon, but it is growing. Practitioners who work with people whose conspiracy beliefs have produced significant personal or social dysfunction report several consistent patterns. First, direct challenge of the beliefs is almost always counterproductive, activating resistance and reinforcing the conviction that the challenger is either deceived or complicit. Second, the beliefs are almost never the deepest issue. Underlying them consistently are experiences of loss of control, of betrayal, of grief, of unprocessed trauma, of chronic anxiety about a world that feels too large and too complex and too indifferent. Third, The path out of the beliefs, for those who find one, almost always involves the development of alternative sources of meaning, community, and purpose that address the same underlying needs that the conspiracy community was addressing. Fourth, the path out is significantly more available to people who have maintained some relationships outside the conspiracy community, which means that the most effective early intervention is preserving those relationships rather than sacrificing them by making membership in them contingent on abandoning the beliefs. This last finding points to something that goes beyond therapy, a general principle about how societies might respond more effectively to the phenomenon. The impulse to demand that conspiracy believers abandon their beliefs before being welcomed back into mainstream social life is not only ineffective but counterproductive because it removes the social incentive for belief modification while leaving intact all the social rewards of the conspiracy community. What family members and friends of people embedded in conspiracy communities can most usefully do is maintain the relationship without endorsing the beliefs, without making the relationship conditional on belief change, and while offering consistently the lived reality of a person outside the conspiracy framework who is engaged, present, and worth being in contact with. This is enormously difficult, emotionally demanding, and often unsuccessful, but it is more likely to succeed than the alternatives. We have now established two things: what the reptilian conspiracy theory is, and why human psychology makes it appealing. What we have not yet examined in full is the environment in which it lives and grows, the media ecosystem that has grown up around it, the political movements it has fertilized, and the specific and documented harms it has produced when the beliefs it generates cross the threshold from private conviction into public action. That is where we go next. The ecosystem and its consequences. On October 28, 2017, at 9:14 in the evening Eastern Time, a user on the anonymous image board 4chan posted the following: HRC extradition already in motion effective yesterday with several countries in case of cross-border. Passport approved to be flagged effective 10:30 0001 East Coast Time. Passport control has been notified to target. POTUS, President of the United States, will be well insulated. The poster signed off with Q Clearance Patriot. This was the first post in what would become the QAnon phenomenon, the largest and most rapidly growing conspiracy theory movement in the first quarter of the 21st century, one that would eventually reach into the mainstream of American politics, with consequences that included an attack on the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. And it was, in its fundamental structure, the reptilian conspiracy theory in updated dress. The continuity between QAnon and the ICI framework is not an academic observation. It is traceable through specific claims, specific sources, and specific individuals. QAnon's central allegation that a cabal of satanic pedophiles controls the world's governments and cultural institutions and ritually abuses and murders children is identical in structure to ICI's claim about the reptilian elite. The cast of villains overlaps almost precisely. The specific motif of children as victims, of blood as a consumed substance, of ritual as the mechanism of energy generation, is taken directly from the framework that ICI popularized across the preceding 20 years. QAnon did not invent these claims. It gamified them, applying the interactive mechanics of alternate reality games to a belief system that had been in development since the 1990s, and delivering the result through social media platforms to an audience of millions that ICI had spent decades building. The gamification dimension of QAnon represents a genuine innovation in the conspiracy format. Rather than simply consuming content that explains the conspiracy, QAnon participants were invited to decode cryptic posts, search for hidden meanings, connect publicly available information in ways that appeared to reveal the outlines of the secret network, and share their findings with the community in a collaborative investigation that felt, to its participants, like genuine research and genuine discovery. This participatory format addressed the most powerful psychological need in the conspiracy audience, the need not just to know but to do, not just to receive the truth, but to find it. Every new connection drawn, every new piece of the puzzle that appeared to fit, every decoding of a new Q post produced a neurochemical reward that is structurally identical to the reward produced by solving a puzzle or winning a game. The conspiracy became literally addictive in its engagement loop, and it produced a level of emotional investment in participants that made exit extraordinarily difficult, and the beliefs extraordinarily durable. The political consequences of QAnon have been examined in detail by journalists, researchers, and congressional investigators, and we will not rehearse them in full here. What is important for the purposes of this documentary is the way QAnon represents the mainstreaming of the reptilian conspiracy framework. Icky's audience through the 1990s and 2000s was real and significant, but remained broadly alternative. It was found in New Age bookshops and conspiracy radio and esoteric conferences and, increasingly, online forums. It did not penetrate the mainstream of electoral politics in any direct and measurable way. QAnon changed this. By 2020, polling indicated that between 1 in 6 and 1 in 4 American adults believed in some version of the core QAnon claim that a cabal of satanic pedophiles controlled key American institutions and that Donald Trump was covertly fighting them. Several QAnon believers won seats in the United States Congress. The Republican Party's relationship to QAnon belief within its base became a significant feature of American political analysis. The belief system that Icky had been cultivating for 3 decades had, through the specific mechanisms of the contemporary media ecosystem, achieved mass political salience in the world's most powerful democracy. This mainstreaming was not an accident. It was the product of an ecosystem that had been building for decades and that by 2020 had achieved a scale and a level of infrastructure that made it capable of delivering conspiratorial content at the volume and with the credibility necessary to reach far beyond the communities that had previously been its home. The conspiracy media ecosystem is complex and internally differentiated, but its basic structure can be described as a series of concentric circles, ranging from the most extreme and explicit fringe content at the center to increasingly mainstream adjacent content at the periphery, with steady traffic between the circles as people move inward through the process of radicalization and outward as content producers attempt to translate fringe audiences into mainstream political influence. At the center, in the explicit fringe, you find content that makes the claims of the reptilian theory directly and specifically, websites and channels and Telegram groups where David Icky's books are discussed, where bloodline genealogies are compiled, where the specific identities of reptilian hybrids are debated, where the mechanisms of energetic harvesting and consciousness suppression are analyzed in detail. This content is explicitly alternative and self-consciously outside the mainstream, and it serves primarily to maintain and deepen the commitment of already converted believers. Moving outward from this center, you find a large middle zone of content that shares the structural assumptions of the reptilian framework without necessarily using the specific reptilian vocabulary. This is the zone of content about the New World Order, about the Illuminati, about George Soros as a global puppet master, about Bill Gates and vaccine microchips, about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda as a plan for global totalitarianism, about the Rothschilds and the central banks, about COVID as a manufactured crisis. This content is produced by a wide range of actors. Some are sincere believers in the framework they promote. Some are opportunists who have identified a profitable audience and produce content calibrated to its appetites, and some are state-sponsored information operators who deliberately seed and amplify this content as part of foreign influence operations. The Russian Internet Research Agency, the organization revealed in the Mueller investigation to have conducted a systematic campaign of social media manipulation around the 2016 American presidential election, produced a large volume of content in this middle zone, content that did not explicitly reference reptilians, but that amplified and validated the structural assumptions of the framework. At the outer ring of the ecosystem, you find mainstream political and media figures who draw on the emotional and political energy generated by the inner circles without explicitly endorsing the conspiracy claims. This includes politicians who campaign on the threat of a globalist elite, a term that has clear overlap with the conspiracy framework's vocabulary without specifying whether that elite is human or otherwise. It includes media personalities who describe the World Economic Forum or the United Nations or the World Health Organization in language that maps closely onto the hidden controller narrative without claiming that the controllers are reptilian hybrids. It includes religious leaders who frame contemporary political events in terms of cosmic warfare between the forces of light and the forces of darkness in ways that provide theological cover for conspiratorial politics. The Outer Ring can genuinely claim not to be part of the conspiracy movement, and in most cases, its participants would be sincerely horrified to be identified with reptilian shapeshifters. But the emotional and political energy they mobilize, the generalized sense of threat from a hidden controlling elite, is the same energy that the inner circles generate and refine, and it flows between the circles in both directions. The economic dimension of this ecosystem deserves sustained attention because it is substantial and because it creates incentives that are independent of the sincerity of any particular belief. The conspiracy media economy is built on the same advertising and subscription models as mainstream media, but it has several distinctive features that make it particularly lucrative in certain segments. Conspiracy audiences are loyal. They are defined by their distrust of mainstream sources, which means that once they have found a source they trust within the alternative ecosystem, they tend to return to it consistently and to consume large amounts of content. They are also highly susceptible to certain categories of advertising and product promotion: health supplements positioned as alternatives to the pharmaceutical system, survival equipment for the coming collapse, gold and silver as alternatives to the fiat currency system controlled by the central banks, firearms and ammunition, and increasingly premium content subscriptions that offer access to material too sensitive for the mainstream platforms. Alex Jones, whose InfoWars operation is among the most prominent examples of this model, generated an estimated $80 million in annual revenue at its peak primarily through the sale of health supplements and personal care products to an audience that InfoWars conspiracy content had primed to distrust mainstream pharmaceutical and consumer products companies. Jones's legal and financial troubles following his defamation of the Sandy Hook massacre families created a partial disruption of this model, but the fundamental economics that InfoWars exemplified have been replicated across hundreds of smaller operations. David Icke's own financial operation, while less extravagant than Jones's, follows a similar structure. Book sales, event tickets, merchandise, and digital subscriptions combine to generate revenue that funds a small organization capable of continuous content production and global distribution. The specific financial details of Icke's operation are not publicly disclosed, as he operates through a complex of private companies, but estimates from industry analysts suggest annual revenues in the range of several million pounds at the height of his platform period. The point is not that this is a remarkably large amount of money, though it is substantial for a one-man media operation without mainstream distribution. The point is that the commercial structure creates a continuous and powerful incentive to produce content that maintains and grows the audience, which means content that confirms and deepens the beliefs that define the audience, that introduces new threats and new revelations that keep the audience engaged and invested, and that positions the content producer as uniquely positioned to provide the knowledge that the audience needs and cannot get elsewhere. The consequence of this incentive structure is that the conspiracy ecosystem is evolutionarily optimized for the production of content that maximizes engagement rather than content that maximizes truth. Content that challenges the audience's beliefs, that introduces genuine ambiguity, that acknowledges the limits of evidence, is not rewarded by the ecosystem's economics or by its social dynamics. Content that confirms fears, that reveals new conspiracies, that expands the network of identified enemies, that deepens the sense of urgency and threat, is rewarded consistently. The result is a ratcheting process. The ecosystem as a whole tends, over time, toward more extreme claims, more expansive conspiracy networks, more urgent apocalyptic framing, because these qualities are what the economic and social logic of the ecosystem selects for. The real-world harms produced by this ecosystem are documented, varied, and in some cases fatal. The most direct form of harm is violence. The murders in Pittsburgh, the shootings in various synagogues, mosques, and grocery stores committed by individuals whose stated ideological frameworks drew directly from the elite control conspiracy tradition. These are the most extreme cases, and they are not representative of the typical conspiracy believer who does not commit violence and who would likely be horrified by these acts. But they are the predictable tale of a distribution, the small percentage of a very large population of belief who combine the conspiracy framework with a disposition toward violence and a specific target identification. As the population of believers grows, the absolute number of people at the tail of that distribution grows with it, and the probability of violent events increases accordingly. Less dramatic but more widespread are the harms that arise from the collision of conspiracy belief with public health. The anti-vaccine movement, which significantly overlaps with the elite conspiracy ecosystem, produced a measurable resurgence of diseases like measles that had been effectively eliminated from the population through vaccination. The specific harm of vaccine hesitancy generated by conspiracy content about pharmaceutical companies and government health agencies during the COVID-19 pandemic is difficult to quantify with precision because vaccine uptake is affected by many factors, but research consistently associates exposure to COVID misinformation, including the kinds of misinformation produced by the conspiracy ecosystem, with reduced vaccine uptake, and reduced vaccine uptake was associated with increased hospitalizations and deaths during the pandemic. A meta-analysis published in Nature Human Behavior in 2022 found strong and consistent associations between conspiracy belief and vaccine hesitancy across multiple countries and multiple time points during the pandemic. These are not theoretical harms, they are deaths that would not have occurred if the people who died had received available protective treatment. There is also the harm to families and communities. Researchers who study the human cost of conspiracy belief document consistent patterns of social fragmentation, relationships severed by irreconcilable disagreement about reality, families broken by the inability to communicate across the epistemic divide that conspiracy belief creates, communities fractured as neighbors who once shared a basic factual framework about the world find themselves unable to do so. This harm is diffuse and difficult to quantify, but it is, in aggregate, enormous. It represents a form of social destruction that is perhaps even more consequential in the long run than the specific acts of violence that attract journalistic attention, because it erodes the fabric of shared reality that is the precondition of democratic life. Democratic systems depend, at their most fundamental level, on a sufficient degree of shared factual reality that citizens can deliberate together about matters of collective concern, can evaluate the claims of politicians and the evidence of experts against a common standard, and can hold those with power accountable through informed collective judgment. When a significant portion of the population inhabits a different factual reality, in which mainstream institutions are comprehensively captured by a hidden controlling elite, and in which all official information is presumptively false, this precondition is severely compromised. Not because the people who hold conspiracy beliefs are bad citizens, but because the beliefs themselves make the practices of democratic citizenship, informed evaluation of evidence, trust in transparent institutions, willingness to accept legitimate outcomes even when unfavorable, structurally impossible. You cannot make an informed vote on a healthcare policy if you believe that the medical system is a tool of a depopulation agenda. You cannot accept the results of an election if you believe the electoral system is controlled by the entities you are trying to vote against. You cannot hold institutions accountable through democratic processes if you believe that all institutions are wholly owned by the enemy. This is why the reptilian conspiracy theory and the broader elite control conspiracy tradition, of which it is the most vivid expression, is not merely a matter of individual belief and individual harm. It is a systemic threat to the political infrastructure of democratic societies, one that is growing rather than shrinking, that is accelerating rather than decelerating, and that is proving extraordinarily resistant to the conventional mechanisms by which democracies manage the challenge of misinformation. The role of state actors in deliberately amplifying and spreading these belief systems is an under-examined dimension of the problem. Russian information operations, as documented by the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Mueller investigation, and independent researchers at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Stanford Internet Observatory, systematically promoted conspiracy content across American social media platforms, specifically content that eroded trust in institutions, deepened social divisions, and amplified the narrative of a corrupt and hidden controlling elite. This content did not always take the specific form of the reptilian theory, but it consistently reinforced the structural assumptions of the framework, that official institutions lie, that the real controllers of events are hidden, that the visible political process is a performance concealing a deeper reality. Chinese state-sponsored information operations have pursued similar strategies in different contexts. Iranian operations have targeted specific communities with tailored versions of the elite control narrative. The common thread is the recognition by actors whose interests lie in the destabilization of Western democracies that the elite conspiracy framework is among the most effective available tools for that purpose. This recognition has reached a level of explicit articulation within the academic and policy communities that study information warfare. A 2019 report by the European External Action Service noted that the systematic promotion of conspiracy narratives is a core tactic of information warfare operations, precisely because it exploits existing social tensions and psychological vulnerabilities rather than requiring the creation of new ones from scratch. It is, in the language of information warfare, a force multiplier. It takes the pre-existing grievances of a population and amplifies them in directions that serve the amplifier's interests, while appearing to the targets to be organic expression of their own concerns. David Ickey's 30 years of audience building effectively created an infrastructure that state-level bad actors could parasitize for their own purposes, using the existing networks of distrust and alternative information consumption to introduce content that served geopolitical rather than merely cultural objectives. The relationship between the conspiracy ecosystem and mainstream politics has evolved significantly over the course of the 21st century. In the first decade, conspiracy belief remained broadly alternative in the political sense, associated with figures and movements on the margins rather than at the center of electoral politics. The 9/11 Truth movement attracted significant grassroots support but remained outside the mainstream of either major American political party. The second decade saw a significant change as the economic shock of the financial crisis, the rise of social media as a primary political information environment, and the specific media dynamics of the Obama and Trump eras combined to move conspiracy frameworks substantially closer to the center. By the third decade, in the 2020s, the distinction between mainstream political discourse and conspiracy discourse had, in significant portions of the American political landscape, effectively collapsed. Members of Congress made arguments in committee hearings that would have been at home on Ickey's website. Presidential candidates amplified claims about elite pedophile networks. State-level politicians introduced legislation against threats that existed only in the conspiracy imagination. The infrastructure of democratic governance was being operated by people who had, to varying degrees of depth, absorbed the worldview that democratic governance was irredeemably controlled by a hidden enemy. This is not to say that the reptilian theory itself has become mainstream. The specific claim about shape-shifting lizards retains its ability to shock and its power to prompt ridicule, which is part of why careful political actors who draw on the conspiracy energy tend to avoid the most explicitly reptilian language while embracing the structural assumptions that underlie it. But the underlying structure, the hidden elite, the demonic controllers, the manufactured crises, the deliberate harm of ordinary people for the benefit of an alien-minded ruling class, has moved from the fringe to the political center with a speed that most observers did not anticipate, and that existing democratic institutions are struggling to accommodate. The researchers who study this phenomenon are not optimistic about its near-term trajectory. The conditions that generated the demand for conspiracy belief, institutional failure, economic inequality, epistemic fragmentation, social isolation, the collapse of trusted information environments, are not improving. The technologies that amplify and accelerate conspiracy belief, social media platforms with engagement-maximizing algorithms, encrypted messaging networks that allow radicalization to proceed outside any public view, cheap and sophisticated content production tools that allow misinformation to achieve high production values, indistinguishable from legitimate journalism, are not going away and are not being effectively regulated. The political will to address these conditions and these technologies is limited, both because the interests that profit from them are powerful and because, in the specific case of social media, the line between regulating misinformation and regulating speech is genuinely difficult to draw in ways consistent with democratic values. There is one more dimension of the consequence story that requires acknowledgement, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable: the way in which the conspiracy ecosystem has found specific purchase within communities that have genuine, documented, historical reasons for institutional distrust. Black Americans who have been subjected to documented medical experimentation, documented police violence, documented systematic exclusion from social and economic opportunity, and documented surveillance and disruption of political organizing by their own government have specific and historically grounded reasons to be skeptical of the institutions that the conspiracy framework targets. Indigenous communities across North America, Australia, and elsewhere, whose relationship with the state has been defined by documented betrayal, cultural genocide, and ongoing dispossession, are not being irrational when they distrust official narratives. Communities in the developing world that have been subjected to the documented exploitation of corporate and governmental actors from the global north have specific and grounded reasons to see the relationship between elite power and ordinary people through a lens very different from the optimistic institutional trust that the conspiracy framework sets itself against. When conspiracy content reaches these communities, it does not arrive as an absurdity to be dismissed. It arrives as a pattern that fits, and the challenge that this creates for those who want to address the harms of conspiracy belief is an acute one, because the corrective cannot be a simple reaffirmation of institutional trustworthiness when the institutions in question have earned the distrust of specific communities through documented action. The corrective has to involve something harder: the acknowledgement of legitimate grievance, the genuine accountability of institutions for their documented failures, and the construction of alternative frameworks for understanding power and seeking remedy that are accurate enough and emotionally adequate enough to compete with the conspiracy narrative for the attention of people whose lives have given them every reason to think that the official story is not the whole story. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, but it may be the most important thing that can be done. The reckoning. There is a woman in Birmingham who has been out of the conspiracy world for 4 years. She came to the reptilian theory through grief, as we have described in this documentary. Her mother's death, her rage at the medical system, her search for a framework adequate to her loss. She spent 6 years immersed in it. She left, she says, not because anyone proved her wrong, and not because she ran out of evidence. She left because her daughter was born, and she held this child in her arms in the hospital where the child had been delivered by doctors she had spent 3 years believing were complicit in a genocidal agenda, and she looked at the faces of the nurses who had cared for her daughter through an emergency delivery, and she could not make them fit the category that her beliefs required. They were too human, they were too tired and too kind and too present. And something cracked, not immediately, not completely, but enough that she started, quietly and privately, to doubt. And in that crack, over the following months, while she maintained her conspiracy social media accounts and attended her conspiracy group's meetings and said the things she was expected to say, she was also reading differently than she had read before, reading with a questions rather than a destination, and eventually she found her way out. Her story is not a triumph. it is still partial. She still believes, she told us, that pharmaceutical companies prioritize profit over patients, which is a documented fact. She still believes that mainstream media is too close to corporate and governmental power, which is something that serious media critics across the political spectrum argue in various forms. She does not believe in reptilians. She does not believe that the British royal family drinks blood. She does not believe that a hidden non-human elite is harvesting human fear as energy. But the journey out of those specific beliefs has left her in a complicated epistemic position, skeptical of institutions in ways that are often warranted, but unsure of how to calibrate that skepticism, unsure of which sources to trust, unsure of how to distinguish legitimate concern from conspiratorial projection. She is doing the work of figuring it out, and she says it is the hardest intellectual work she has ever done, because the conspiracy community gave her a complete and ready-made epistemology, a set of rules for evaluating every claim, and leaving required not just abandoning specific beliefs, but rebuilding her entire relationship with evidence, expertise, and uncertainty from the ground up. Her story points towards something that the research on de-radicalization consistently confirms, that leaving a totalistic belief system is not primarily an intellectual event. It is a social, emotional, and identity event of the first magnitude, one that requires the reconstruction of self, community, and purpose alongside the reconstruction of a factual framework. The intellectual component, the reassessment of evidence, the recalibration of trust and expertise, is in some ways the easiest part. The harder parts are the loss of community, the loss of mission, the loss of the specific identity of the person who knows, and the confrontation with the ordinary uncertainty and complexity of a world that no longer comes with a complete explanatory key. The people who study how to help individuals exit conspiracy communities have developed a range of approaches, and the most effective share several features. They are relationship-based rather than argument-based. They meet people where they are, rather than demanding that people come to where the helper is. They acknowledge the legitimate underlying concerns and experiences that made the conspiracy community appealing, rather than dismissing the entire journey as delusion or stupidity. They offer alternative sources of the things the conspiracy community provided: community, purpose, meaning, and the satisfaction of investigation and discovery. And they are patient in ways that feel almost impossibly demanding to the family members, partners, and friends of people embedded in these communities, who often want resolution faster than it is available. Several organizations have developed expertise in this work. Life After Hate, an American organization founded by former far-right extremists, provides exit support for people leaving both explicitly racist movements and conspiracy-adjacent groups, and its methodology emphasizes the relationship-based approach. The organization Moonshot CVE, which operates across multiple countries, has developed specific protocols for working with people identified through their online activity as vulnerable to radicalization, connecting them with trained mentors before radicalization fully takes hold. In Germany, where the Reichsbürger movement has produced significant numbers of people engaged in conspiracy-adjacent anti-government activity, the government has funded exit programs with specific expertise in this area. These programs work. They are not sufficient at the scale of the problem, and they cannot be easily automated or scaled to the millions of people who have been drawn into these communities. But they demonstrate that the phenomenon is not hopeless, that people do leave, that the pathway out exists. The question of what broader structural interventions might address the problem at scale is considerably more contested. Several categories of intervention have been proposed and implemented with varying degrees of effect. Platform regulation is the most actively debated category. The decision by YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and other major platforms to remove content that violates their misinformation policies, and to deplatform figures like David Icke and Alex Jones, who have consistently produced such content, was intended to reduce the reach of the most harmful material. The evidence on its effectiveness is mixed. Deplatforming does appear to reduce the reach of specific figures in the short term, because removal from major platforms dramatically reduces the algorithmic amplification that those platforms provide. But it does not reduce the supply of content or the demand for it. content moves to alternative platforms that are less effectively moderated, more aggressively opposed to any form of content restriction, and often more deeply embedded in the ecosystem of right-wing and conspiratorial media. In some cases, deplatforming appears to produce a rally-around effect, in which the act of restriction is interpreted by the community as confirmation of the conspiracy's reality, generating a temporary surge in engagement and commitment. The long-term effects of major platform deplatforming on the overall scale of conspiracy belief are not yet established. Media literacy education is a second category of intervention, one that enjoys broad support across the political spectrum and that has been implemented in various forms across educational systems in multiple countries. The theory behind media literacy education is that if people are equipped with better tools for evaluating the reliability of information sources, for identifying manipulative content production techniques, for understanding the economic and political incentives that shape media content, they will be better equipped to resist misinformation and conspiracy content. The evidence on this is also mixed. Studies of well-designed media literacy programs show modest positive effects on the ability to identify specific types of misleading content, but the effects do not generalize well from the specific examples used in training to the broader landscape of real-world misinformation and the specific psychological dynamics of motivated reasoning and social embedding that make conspiracy belief resistant to factual correction also make it resistant to media literacy training when people are already embedded in conspiratorial communities. Media literacy is more effective as prevention than as cure, and its effects are most significant when it is implemented early and in environments where the social climate is not already heavily conspiratorial. The transparency and accountability of institutions is a third and often underemphasized category. Because the conspiracy ecosystem feeds on the genuine failures of institutions, one of the most powerful potential countermeasures is the demonstration that institutions can be held accountable for those failures, that the gap between official narrative and reality can be closed through legitimate means, that the mechanisms of democratic accountability function well enough to address the grievances that drive people into conspiratorial explanatory frameworks. This is, in many ways, the hardest intervention to implement because it requires political will and institutional reform rather than media strategy or educational programming, but it is, in some respects, the most fundamental. A society in which the financial crisis of 2008 had been followed by meaningful accountability for the actors responsible would have given fewer people a reason to conclude that the system is so thoroughly captured by the powerful that only a conspiracy framework can explain it. A healthcare system that did not regularly bankrupt its users, a political system whose outcomes did not so consistently favor concentrated wealth over distributed populations, a media ecosystem that was more thoroughly independent of the corporate and governmental interests it is supposed to scrutinize. All of these would reduce the legitimate grievances that the conspiracy framework parasitizes. None of this is to say that institutional reform would make conspiracy belief disappear. The psychological appeal of the hidden controller narrative is too deep and too fundamental to human cognition to be fully addressed by any set of structural changes. But it would narrow the gap between the world the conspiracy theory describes and the world that actually exists. And in doing so, it would reduce the emotional and evidential pull of the conspiracy framework for the people whose distrust of institutions is grounded in experience rather than in epistemological disposition alone. The scholars who have spent careers studying this phenomenon tend to resist both optimism and despair when asked about its prospects. Kathleen Blee, a sociologist who has studied extremist movements for decades and who has written extensively on the psychology of radicalization and de-radicalization, argues that the current moment, despite its alarming features, is not unprecedented in its fundamental dynamics. Every major period of social disruption, she observes, including industrialization, the two world wars, the Great Depression, the post-war social upheaval of the 1960s and 1970s, has produced an upsurge in conspiratorial thinking and in the movements that exploit it. The specific technologies and specific targets change with each period, but the underlying structure remains remarkably constant. And in each previous period, Instead, the upsurge eventually moderated, not because the underlying appeal of the framework disappeared, but because the specific conditions of social disruption that had generated the acute demand for it eased, because the institutions that had lost credibility managed, through some combination of reform and demonstrated competence, to recover some of it, and because the movements that had risen on the energy of conspiratorial thinking burned themselves out or were discredited by their own excesses. This historical perspective is genuinely useful, not because it allows complacency, but because it reframes the question. The question is not how to eliminate the reptilian conspiracy framework, which is probably not achievable. The question is how to manage the conditions that make it appealing, to narrow the gap between institutional reality and the lived experience of the populations that institutions are supposed to serve, to maintain sufficient shared factual reality for democratic deliberation to function, and to limit the scale of the harms that the theory produces in the interim. These are achievable goals, even if they are demanding ones. There is also the question of what we owe to the people inside the belief system, not in the sense of validating beliefs that are false and harmful, but in the sense of maintaining the distinction between the belief and the believer. The man in rural Ohio who has lost his family to this framework is not the enemy. He is a person who was failed by institutions, who was looking for meaning in the wreckage of that failure, who found a community that offered it at a price he did not fully understand he was paying until he had already paid most of it. The woman in Birmingham who spent 6 years believing that doctors were complicit in a genocidal agenda is not a monster. She was a grieving daughter who needed a story adequate to her loss and who found one in the wrong place. The people who populate the conspiracy ecosystem, from the casual YouTube viewer who enjoys the transgressive thrill of questioning official narratives to the deeply embedded true believer who has organized their entire life around the framework, are overwhelmingly people in pain. They are people who feel powerless, who feel deceived, who feel that the world they were promised and the world they actually live in are irreconcilably different, and who have found, in the conspiracy community, a space where those feelings are not pathologized or dismissed, but validated and given form. That does not make the beliefs true. It does not excuse the harms they cause, whether in the specific form of violence or in the diffuse form of social fracture and democratic degradation, but it does mean that an adequate response to the phenomenon cannot be built on contempt or dismissal. It has to be built on the recognition that something real is being addressed by these beliefs. Even if the address is catastrophically wrong, the real things are real. Institutions do fail. Power does operate in self-interested ways that cause genuine harm to ordinary people. Official narratives are often incomplete or misleading. The gap between the world as represented by those with power and the world as experienced by those without it is real and consequential. A society that wants to address the conspiracy crisis has to address those real things, as well as the false frameworks in which they are currently being processed. What would it look like to take seriously both the illegitimate conclusions and the legitimate grievances? It would look like journalism that is doggedly committed to investigating and exposing actual abuses of power, not because that journalism will satisfy conspiracy believers who have already decided that mainstream journalists are complicit, but because it would address the factual record in ways that over time contribute to the accountability that rebuilds some form of institutional credibility. It would look like political movements that translate legitimate economic and social grievances into policy programs rather than conspiratorial frameworks, demonstrating by their success that the mechanisms of democratic engagement can produce real change. It would look like educational systems that teach critical thinking not as a set of techniques for identifying specific types of false claims, but as a broad disposition toward evidence, uncertainty, and the ongoing revision of belief in response to new information. It would look like social media platforms that are held accountable for the downstream consequences of their recommendation systems, not through government-mandated content control, but through research transparency, algorithm audits, and the regulatory imposition of design requirements that break the engagement maximization logic that drives radicalization. It would look like communities that maintain the social fabric across epistemic divides, that preserve relationships with people who have gone into conspiratorial darkness, not by abandoning the commitment to truth, but by maintaining the commitment to the person. None of this is simple. None of it is fast. None of it produces the clean resolution that the conspiracy narrative itself provides. The enemy identified, the plot exposed, the awakening achieved. The real world does not offer that kind of resolution, and one of the deepest harms that the conspiracy tradition inflicts on its believers is training them to expect and demand it, training them to find the ordinary, grinding, partial, reversible, ambiguous work of democratic life unsatisfying by comparison with the dramatic clarity of the hidden truth revealed. But the ordinary, grinding, partial work is the work. It is the only work that actually produces the accountability and the justice and the genuine exposure of genuine abuses of power that conspiracy believers say they want, and that the rest of us should also want, regardless of whether we have been persuaded that the specific mechanism of the abuse involves shape-shifting lizards. There is a postscript to the story of the man in rural Ohio. He told us, near the end of our conversation with him, that he had recently begun talking again to his daughter, not about the beliefs. They both knew that conversation would go nowhere, but about her life, about his grandchildren, about the things they had in common before the divide opened. He had not changed his mind about anything, he said, but he had decided that he did not want to lose his daughter. He had decided that the connection was more important than the argument, and he was, in that decision, doing something that none of the debunking and the deplatforming and the media literacy training had managed to do. He was maintaining a thread that might, eventually, given time and patience and the right conditions, be enough to pull him back. Not all the way, maybe not even most of the way, but back. That thread is thin, but it is real. And in a story that offers very few reasons for anything resembling hope, the persistence of connection, the refusal of love to be fully colonized by epistemology, is perhaps the most honest one available. The world is not controlled by reptilians. It is controlled, to varying degrees and in various combinations, by human beings, fallible, self-interested, sometimes venal, sometimes genuinely trying to do right, subject to the same cognitive biases and social pressures and emotional needs as everyone else, possessed of far more power than they deserve, and far less omniscience than their power would require for any conspiracy of the kind described to function. The systems they operate are not perfectly designed machines of exploitation, but chaotic, contested, incompetently managed engines of competing interests, producing bad outcomes, not because a hidden elite has engineered those outcomes, but because complex systems operated by fallible people under conditions of imperfect information and conflicting incentives produce bad outcomes, regularly, as a feature rather than a bug. This is genuinely terrible news, because it means there is no hidden hand to expose, no single moment of revelation that would dissolve the whole thing, no enemy to defeat that would then allow the good world to emerge. It means the work is perpetual, and the victories are partial, and the system never stops needing to be watched and challenged and reformed. That is not a story as satisfying as the one about lizards, but it is the only one that is true, and in the end, the truth is what the work is for. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.